Hey everyone, I'm Jack,
And I'm Alex.
and in today's video we'll be ranking the bosses of the newly released God of War Ragnarok from worst to best. Over the course of Ragnarok's 20-hour campaign and dozens of side quests across the 9 realms, there were an abundance of bosses of all shapes and sizes. The majority reskins of high-tier enemies. Instead of making a 70-deep list, we decided on bundling up this giant conglomerate of rehashed goons as one single grouping we politely named Worthless Fodder. This includes the Hateful, Fisk, the Oathguards, Blaton, Ormstunga, among many others, and we did the same with other enemy groups featuring multiple variants like Drakes, Dragons, and so on. Beyond these generally insignificant mini-bosses, however, God of War Ragnarok greatly improved on God of War 2018's second-rate boss catalog, with quite a few showings bringing back tinges of the flair, scale, and spectacle that has been noticeably missing from the boss fights of the God of War series since God of War 3 over a decade ago. Ragnarok's combat was great fun, and many of the later bosses in this video make use of its mechanics exceptionally well by mixing cinematic spectacle with intricate combat design, and I think it's safe to say this game was an improvement on its already critically acclaimed prequel. The conclusion to the short-lived Norse saga has some of the best boss fights of any God of War game, and has by far the largest selection of bosses from the series as well. How do they stack up? Let's find out.
I hope none of you guys died from shock. This assortment of buffed normal enemies is a lot like trail mix. Sometimes you get a peanut and sometimes you get a raisin. Unless you actually like raisins, in which case my analogy falls apart. No accounting for taste. Let's start with Ormstrunga, a boss I vaporized in mere seconds due to finding it late in my run. I had no qualms with it until Jack showed me what this thing is like in a fair fight. I cannot imagine that this thing was made for any singular purpose other than to inspire rage and hatred in the player. Enemies that dodge stuff are always frustrating, something Santa Monica is clearly aware of given they gave that ability to Heimdall, who would make the likes of even Hermes drop out of the biggest cocksucker competition. There is no catharsis with Ormstrunga, however, given how irrelevant and spontaneous of a fight it is. It's moments like this that make me bemoan the new Gandhi of War approach they took to combat, with Kratos no longer inflicting lengthy, cruel finishers on his enemies upon bringing them near death. This fucker should have met his end the way of King Minos from Dante's Inferno. Next on the chopping block is the Hateful. The name says it all. Joggers with frustratingly high stats. Takes me back to playing God of War 2018 on any difficulty above Give Me Story. The unblockable combo finishers are about as much fun as a root canal if it were performed by a drunken chimp. Fisk? Well, he's actually pretty cool. I did put this motley group at number 19 after all. They aren't totally irredeemable. Scythes are a cool weapon, and I'd personally call this guy a heavy enemy done right. Do you want to see a heavy enemy done wrong? Look no farther than the Oathguards, or Travelers, or whatever you wish to call them. It was Shakespeare who penned the saying, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Well, the inverse is true of sewage and rat shit. Nothing spells fun like getting half your health blown out during a runic attack because the developers felt like giving these guys giant dad levels of poise. Yes, I'm aware I can cancel out of that with a roll, but is that really fun to you, having to stop your fun awesome attacks halfway through? That's like jerking off and then tying barbed wire around your shaft before you can finish coming. Fuck these guys. On a more positive note, we have Blaton, or neutral note, I suppose. If he was a food, he would taste like nothing. This is the tap water of boss fights. I think I also 0 to death comboed him, nothing to say here. Cool finisher even if it was ripped straight from the last game. Lastly, we have the Raider Chieftains. I dig these guys, hard to find much else to add. I'm like Saul Goodman, bad at building things up, excellent at tearing things down. With regards to videos anyways, in real life I'm a happy-go-lucky bundle of joy, trust me. Well, I want to say that covers it. If we forgot someone, my excuse is that it was clearly so unmemorable it deserved to be ignored.
Well, Alex had all the fun. Basically every fight in this game that's not a gank or fodder, as you'll come to see, is at least passing, which provides a bit of a problem. And why is that a problem, you may ask? Well, from lots of experience, scripting and talking about nothing fights is drab. The dragons, meaning the aerial dragons found in the crater in Vanaheim, barely qualify as boss fights. It speaks volumes that these guys are comparable in moveset variety to the random bridge dragons found in all of the Dark Souls games, and at least those didn't waste your time. It took me forever to figure out that you had to throw your axe at dragons when they swoop down to firebomb you instead of the spear, because the tutorial indicator tells you to look for a weak spot. that you'd use a spear for in every other instance. The weak spot, as indicated, is actually just the dragon itself, unlike every other weak spot mechanic in the game. When you hit it back to earth, it has easy to avoid or simply blockable breath attacks and stomps and such. It's a dragon mini-boss in a third-person video game. Next.
As the first boss of the game, I wasn't expecting anything too wild. A fight as bare bones as this doesn't deserve any ridicule at any rate. Dodge and whack the bear with the axe till it dies, or rather until you find out it's actually your son. Oops. That could have taken the game in a way different direction now, couldn't it? I suppose in retrospect it's nice that Atreus can actually turn into animals as he optimistically suggested in the last game, and they say dreams can't come true. Dodging becomes one of my most hated mechanics in this game in the more intricate fights, more on that later, but here it is simply in its infancy and correspondingly innocent. Tabula rasa.
Ancients make a grand return to the bottom of a God of War boss ranking. Yeah, it should be no surprise seeing these old heads at the rear end of this video. If you didn't like them in 2018, you won't like them now. They are literally the exact same in every way. We both had a problem with finding openings without taking damage, as their design is a bit counterintuitive. The only time you can damage Ancients is when they open up their chest cavity, which is also the only time they can attack you. It makes it a game of tank the damage and do as much as you can, like a mutual artillery bombing. Not bad, just frustrating in larger arenas with enemy padding where you have to balance multiple fights at once.
I think the Huntress is a pretty cool boss. She starts off with a neat intro and breaks your shield, requiring you to primarily dodge her attacks in the first fight. That said, his shield is hardly much use against this lot anyways. That unblockable charge attack they do emerging from rifts is something I just gave up hope of ever countering. Functionally, it is very similar to Bjorn given its early placement, but it's got more interesting design and the weak point mechanic is satisfying when you get it down. It didn't appear often enough in the game to train me to look for it, so these lovely ladies and the Phantoms are the only cases where I can actually recall seeing and exploiting it. That attack where they trample Kratos is cool, although it can grow tiresome if it happens to you too many times in one fight. All the circle mashing begins to feel like I'm playing a particularly button-mashy Mario Party minigame. If only there were other ways to structure quick-time events besides mashing circle. That'd be crazy, right?
What's the difference between a drake and a dragon? In definition, nothing at all. In this case, we use the term drake to distinguish the terrestrial dragons from the aerial dragons, although the quality difference is still next to none. Drakes are maybe the tankiest enemies in the game. Even with level 9 weapons and green health bars, they will take you 3 to 4 minutes to whittle down. AKA, they're a big fucking pain in the ass.
Phantoms work extremely uniquely, which is a point in their favor in some ways, although it also lends itself to player confusion. Given their resemblance to the Wisps, I was under the impression that only Freya's elemental arrows could raise its stagger meter and open the totems to attack. This made for a rather boring fight where I just ran away and spammed the square button for 10 minutes, whittling the first one down like a Cub Scout forging a Pinewood Derby car. Unfortunately, they have lots of unblockable attacks, and fiery ones can, well, set you on fire. This wouldn't be such a big deal if it didn't mean hearing, "Kratos, you're on fire!" every 2 seconds. Thanks, brother. I never would have known. I appreciate the sentiment behind the Phantoms, and the game is definitely better off with them existing than not, but I never leave an encounter with one on my knees thanking the Lord for their inclusion either.
Closing the chapter on dragon bosses, if you count Dreki as dragons, comes one of the first major enemy encounters in the early game. There are multiple other Dreki fights after this point, including some ganks in Vanaheim and Svartalfheim, but we decided on counting all of them as this single spot. The ganks typically only have one Dreki on land at a time anyways. While the most simplistic of the 3 dragon variants, they're also the most fun due to their agility and counter ability. These fights do drag out, but if you stay fairly aggressive, they should be dead before it gets egregious.
I'm just impressed they made a pacifist fight that wasn't a total bore. Fucked up violence-loving freak that I am, I groaned upon first hearing that I ought to spare this animal-torturing old crone. Ultimately, though, the way it plays out is leagues more interesting than it being an ankle-biting snorefest. Believe me, I've seen quite a few of these in my days. I'm something of an authority at this point. Instead of turning her innards into outards, as with most bosses, your goal is to break her witch's cauldron full of souls and whatever else is in there. Eye of Newt, dead rat tails, and whatever other chalice dungeon ritual items witches are into these days. You can fire arrows at it to raise the stun meter and bring her down for some melee time against the pot, made easier if you signal Angra Boda to blind her with some light. It's a lot like how I imagined the Jack and the Beanstalk fairy tale playing out, only thing missing was the fee-fi-fo-fums. While the Jotunheim segment is among the most dull things I have ever experienced in my almost 19 years of life, leading me to prematurely dub the game God of Snore Midnarok, it at least caps off with a memorable fight that flipped the script in a novel way.
It's a bird. It's a plane. Nope, it's a Valkyrie. Oh dear God. It's actually not. Well, it is, but it also isn't. Vanadis is actually just Freya disguised as a Valkyrie. Kratos realizes this pretty quickly on, although the reveal definitely got me, and the fight's abrupt beginning caught me off guard as well. Her moveset isn't particularly noteworthy, but this is the first human boss up to this point, and note a stark rise in quality from here onwards.
This fire and ice troll gank is literally the exact same thing as the Grendel of the Ashes and Frost from 2018. Look, as much hate as the trolls got for being uninteresting, irrelevant fodder that clogged up the boss counter of 2018, I think they're fun to fight at least. It could really have been so much worse. Sometimes you just gotta be thankful for what you have. 'Tis the season after all. That said, 2 at once can be a bit of a pain. The way the camera works in this game means that you can't look behind Kratos without turning him around to face whatever you're looking at. In a game where being off-screen doesn't seem to visibly impact enemy aggression at all AI-wise, this becomes an aggravating nightmare in fights faster paced than this. Thankfully, these 2 big lugs seem to mostly stick together and just swing their big troll rectangles at you. Nail them with the element they don't like and enjoy the fireworks, and ice works in the case of killing the fire troll.
Like the Ancients, trolls make a copy-pasted return in God of War Ragnarok. But unlike Ancients, trolls were the highlight of God of War 2018, not out of quality of boss fight, mind you, rather that they were the only boss fight in the whole game. Luckily, it seems as if they've been phased out almost entirely since then, with there only being 2 living trolls, 1 ice and 1 fire, and 3 stone trolls including the one Alex just went over. Because he just went over trolls, I wouldn't be breaking much new ground rehashing what was just spoken, but note that these fights are higher because ganks in this game simply do not work. Trolls are a lot more enjoyable on their own, and their AoE heavy movesets are a great change of pace from typical large enemies.
It would seem I am fated to cover the group entries of this video, which is fine by me because they tend to be more amusing to script. The Berserkers, despite having a more or less common moveset, differ wildly enough to almost be unique bosses in their own right. Most of them are fine. I quite enjoyed many of them between the pleasant parry-centric challenge of the melee weapon users and the outside-the-box thinking required to take on some of the more atypical ones like the lightning fist guy. I fought a lot of them at like level 4 because I'm such a badass, but my word do they not play around. It's all fun and games as long as you're fighting the one-on-one dudes, much like the Valkyrie hunt in 2018. Why is it number 10, you ask? Well, the true horrors are unleashed in the gank fights among their numbers. I was fortunate enough to fight them after I beat the game and had maxed out gear, but anything short of that leaves you with a nightmare on your hands. I was watching Jack do the 3-person fight in the Alfheim Barrens and was giving me secondhand frustration on his behalf. This game is just not designed around fighting multiple powerful foes at once. At least they're for uncoordinated and not having their aggro split by Atreus or Freya. The clash between fun challenging berserkers and foul dregs from the bowels of hell collide to grant a mid-tier overall ranking for this battle-crazed collective.
Do I have a bias for Souls-esque boss fights featuring extremely varied movesets, fair but intense challenge, and great atmosphere, setting, and score? Or is that just not bias and an objectively good fight instead? Well, that's for the eye of the beholder to judge. This is a rare case of Alex and I just having a completely different experience with the same boss. I had a fantastic time learning all of Gana's tells and slowly getting closer to beating her until I eventually did, and it was a similar experience to overcoming a lot of the best boss fights from the later games in the Souls series. As such, I had Gná at number 4 on my personal ranking, but she evened out here because of our vastly differing opinions. As I previously said, Gná has an extremely wide moveset. She has a spear infused with Bifrost, wings, and all sorts of elemental magic as well. Past her basic combos, she has a multitude of special attacks that are admittedly frustrating at times, namely the aerial stomp and arena-wide slash that require lightning-quick reactions, but they're very cinematic for a non-Thor boss that further emphasizes her quality. While random, Gná is one of the best bosses for me hands down, but falls to the near middle of the list from a simple case of difference of experience between Alex and I.
Oh, zounds, I'm sure this ruffled some feathers, and I'm not just talking about Odin's ravens. For a final boss, I thought this fight was decidedly uncinematic and not very visually interesting. I suppose Zeus was sort of the same way, but I was still hoping for something a little cooler. I thought Odin was definitely an interesting villain, at least definitely the best antagonist in the series thus far. Rather than being an overt scumbag, he comes off as an overly maligned old man, simply seeking peace for about 2/3 of the game. I remember wondering what exactly the problem was with letting him use the mask, and found it interesting how they ultimately left it somewhat ambiguous, with you being left to only assume that it would lead to calamity of some nature. As for the fight itself, I found it alright. He's basically a caster, which makes sense, lots of Bifrost attacks and the like. He's kind enough to not have any timings that are really awkward or delayed, although that one attack where he highlights chunks of ground can go fuck itself. It always starts up while I'm already on an irreversible trajectory jumping between two of the land areas, and then when my brain panics and jumps back instead of running forwards, I get nailed. Totally my fault, so not really an objective flaw, but I feel like that move is irritating as shit all the same. The fight with him in the basement after you beat down his first health bar is kinda anticlimactic. You're 3-on-1ing him, so he doesn't have a shot in hell of surviving. I turned him into mincemeat in record time, and let me just say nothing spells disappointing to me like being able to manhandle the final boss like putty. Maybe beef up his health in this phase or something, methinks. The finisher is a contender for lamest of all time. After a boring forgiveness spiel, Atreus puts him in a Pokeball that then gets crushed by Sindri. I could not think of a more unsatisfying finale if I tried. I get what they were going for. Odin needed to die, but the main characters needed to do something consistent with the thematic message of the game. This is a series of events that satisfies all those outcomes, technically. If you are a fan of how this turned out, I am happy for you. Call me a numbskull, but I thought it would have been way cooler if Odin got to use the mask and it granted him some crazy new form and then you fuck it up in brutal fashion or whatever. This fight was okay mechanically, but for a final boss I expected more cool shit like flying around and throwing him into stuff and all that. This had hardly more fanfare than a troll, making him a middle-of-the-road boss for me.
Alongside Gná, Hrist and Mist are the only other Valkyrie bosses in the game. A delight, I'm sure, for the many of you who fought the army of them in God of War 4. In terms of movesets, they're extremely similar to Gná, but toned down in magic arsenal. However, what they have that no other boss has is multiple fights. Technically. Upon each apparent death, Hrist and Mist respawn with about 1/5 less health each time, but a major increase in damage, with their original health bar starting at a yellow warning color, then an orange danger color, then finally a purple code red color. The purple and red health bars are some of the most intimidating boss fight mechanisms I've experienced, and it just added to the fight's overall atmosphere. Of which is unbelievable. The Spark of the World is such a breathtaking set piece and looks like something out of Guardians of the Galaxy. It was seriously one of, if not the best looking boss arena ever, and that's saying something when compared to the likes of visually top-notch fights from Elden Ring and other boss-oriented games. From this point onwards, fights have very little in negative design choices, with Hrist and Mist falling to the back end of the Elite Club from a lack of importance and general abruptness of their random appearance following the creation of Ragnarok.
The King of the Berserkers is about what you'd expect, essentially all of them rolled into one. Thankfully, he did not inherit the tactic of ganging up on you, which would have been a fast track from 6th place to God knows where. This fight is one of the two super bosses of the game, the other being Gná, who I despise. The big reason Hrolf, H-Rolf, whatever, wins out for me is that he's more based around parrying than dodging, which, as I griped earlier, sucks in this game. As far as I can tell, you literally don't even get iframes, which makes it automatically unbearable dog shit in my book. It's a noob trap, I don't know what else to describe it as. Hrolf is a good sport and more of a fan of sword swings than projectile spam, thankfully for me. While he hits hard and packs quite a sizable health bar with him, he's a very fair fight that I never felt particularly angered towards in my time against him. He's held back only by spectacle, lacking in relevancy or scale, as does any side quest finale by nature. For fun value alone, I might have had him at the top, to be honest. Good man.
There's just something inherently satisfying about killing the big cocksucker archetype in every video game. A comparison to me would be like killing Nikolai in Resident Evil 3. Although the payoff for killing Heimdall was definitely a lot less rewarding than other major deaths in the God of War series from games past, Kratos' general avoidance of death and murder makes for a lot of unintentionally anticlimactic moments, and Heimdall is no exception. Goldtopper was a bit more like it though. While he actually became a common enemy type after this point, it was a dearly needed new experience in combat variety that due to his aggression pits you on defense for long strings at a time. Keep in mind this, nor any other fight is really difficult, but I did struggle reading Goldtopper's tells much more than a lot of other fights. He lacks health, however, and it should become a lone duel with Heimdall fairly quickly. As you experienced as Atreus earlier, Heimdall's Bifrost vision makes him completely aware of everything, meaning he already knows what you're gonna do before you do it and is unhittable in turn. This is where the Draupnir spear comes into play. The longer I had it in my arsenal, the more it grew on me, and while I still prefer the timeless Blades of Chaos, the spear is a phenomenal weapon. Its detonation ability is your only way to partially blind Heimdall, and do it enough and you'll get in a clean hit. From there, the fight's pretty straightforward. Heimdall has a very Bifrost-oriented moveset and is extremely agile. Needless to say, he'll keep you on your toes. Eventually, you'll win. Except, well, you don't win. After pinning Heimdall with your spear and promptly cutting off his arm, Kratos lets him go out of pity, to which Heimdall uses Bifrost to summon a manifestation of his now chopped arm to make one last stand. Kratos attempted to avoid prophecy by not killing Heimdall, although Heimdall gives him no choice but to do so, further proving the prophecy true and making it seem more like Kratos' final destination is death in Atreus' arms after all. Like a lot of second phases in this game, it's the first phase but amped to Mach 10. Nothing's massively different and you should be done with it quick. The death was half-assed on Kratos' part and really does bring down the tone and my retrograde opinion of Heimdall, but still the gameplay alone makes him one of the best offerings God of War Ragnarok has.
Hilariously enough, Jack and I had Odin and Nidhogg occupying complete inverse spots of one another. In my eyes, this boss is a spectacle-filled, intense, old-school romp harkening back to ye olden days of wall bosses galore. Unlike the fights of yore, however, she comes out to play eventually and shakes it up with a transition to a fully three-dimensional battlefield. She's got a cool crystal laser tail, standard melee fare, and is surprisingly mobile for something that large. Kind of a shame this more or less innocent creature had to die. Ironically enough, it's probably the least deserving of death of any foe in the game, and yet is shown the least mercy. Cool and creative finisher at least, sort of a monkey paw that my wish for more bloodshed is granted against the boss I wish the least harm upon. I guess Freya was just in a bad mood. You know, after her son, Baldur, died thanks to Kratos. In case you forgot, just a little refresher. The game really doesn't tell you this enough. Indeed, the title of shittiest boss named Nidhogg remains firmly held by Devil May Cry 5's atrocious take on the Root Guardian. Not that that's a hard act to top, mind you. I'll tear that guy apart another day. Just you wait and see, guys.
Alex and I had inverse opinions on Garm and Odin. Personally, Odin was my third favorite fight behind the two Thor bosses and Garm was eighth, but alas. Of the two, Garm was a much grander spectacle, and because of that I admire the fight dearly. Something like this was so common in God of War 2 and 3 and so scarce in God of War 2018 and Ragnarok that I actually went from expecting spectacle to thoroughly enjoying spectacle. If it was a food, I'd let it savor in my mouth until it melted like a rich, salty wolf caviar. Although the scale is so massive with Garm that it's hard to discern what is and isn't a part of the boss. Alex and I never really went over it, so I'll just say the major arena encounters, but it's worth noting the scripted but somewhat intense chase/hide-and-seek sequences with the Helldog that did create drama in what would otherwise be nothing moments between the separate fights. It was the gameplay that had Garm lower than Odin for me though. While large and dangerous, Garm is so easily predictable and the fight gets quickly repetitive. After every attack he misses, you can knock him down to the floor with his chain, get in a few runic attacks, wait, then rinse and repeat. The later in the fight you get, the more it varies, with him jumping on cliff sides and launching projectiles and such, but it's just not as engaging for me as a lot of other bosses were, even counting in the massive scale of it. There is a shorter but still noteworthy second phase that actually closes the fight, a wall boss as was so common in the old days of God of War. Garm's spectacle was a greatly needed inclusion to Ragnarok, and the gameplay was able to keep up and even evolve Garm's gravitas to even greater heights.
Thor honestly carries the fuck out of this game. His boss fights are both the best in the game and his characterization is awesome. His design ended up being super fitting despite what some naysayers may have said initially, and his personality is great. The God of Thunder lives for two things, meat and murder. Getting drunk and fighting people, that's totally badass. Thor, like me, wants to see the real Kratos. While he only brings him out for a tiddlywink in the first fight, this second fight sees nobody holding back. Now armed with a full endgame toolkit, your every ability is tested in a fun and fair climactic bout. While less climactic than the first encounter for some reason, which admittedly left big shoes to fill, it's still great from a gameplay perspective and probably the most challenging main game fight to beat without dying in my eyes. His ranged unblockable Mjolnir attacks are no joke, and he's more nimble than you'd think thanks to his teleportation abilities. Difficulty aside, not a single one of his moves ever felt unfair to me, and I never found myself cursing one thing or another. Thor suffering the same dilemma as Kratos, albeit to a far greater extent, of not fully understanding how to be a good parent, added some emotional heft to it all too, climaxing with the unfortunate finale courtesy of the Allfucker. This was, I thought, the best moment in the game to show someone if they don't get why Odin is so evil. He's a Machiavellian's Machiavellian, nice until it is no longer useful. He murders his own son simply because he can no longer control him, which is what he wants above all else. Knowledge is simply a means to gain more control, whether he is conscious of this or not. I have a handful of criticisms of the game's narrative, as you can see in our review video I alluded to earlier, but this is not one of them. I can't say this fight is my favorite overall, but it's a strong showing and I could understand it being anyone's favorite pretty easily.
As proven by Baldur in God of War 2018, something along the lines of an incredibly metal and mechanically inventive opening boss fight that pushes Kratos to his limits is just about the best possible way to both start your game and make a boss fight in the process. Was I expecting a bout with Thor in the introduction? Well, yeah, as it was revealed months ago, but I did not expect it to be of the quality it is. It sets the tone for the rest of the narrative by immediately separating Kratos from Atreus to allow Odin to groom Loki, and creates the game-long rivalry between Thor and Kratos that, as Alex just went over, climaxed with one of the best boss fights in the God of War series. The introduction was that much better, however. It was all around genius and had so many memorable moments, from the Leviathan axe and Mjolnir creating an ice-lightning chasm to Thor killing and then reviving Kratos just to awaken his inner Spartan rage and make it a more fun duel. It was just unbelievable. His entire moveset is fair from the most basic punches to the wildest special attacks, and cinematically this beats out Baldur, Poseidon, and the Colossus of Rhodes by a landslide in my opinion. While not as hectic or chaotic as the later duel in Asgard, Thor and Kratos' initial fight in the realm of Midgard was personally my second favorite God of War boss behind only Kronos, and starts off the game in electric fashion.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. Be sure to check out our more general review of the game as well as our other videos on the God of War series. That's all for now. Deuces.